Howdy, and welcome to video 2 of 4 videos on Kosseff Chapter 1. And I've got my book right here beside me because I love this book, and you might want to have your book too. Because what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about the FTC. So if you look on page 1, we're talking about FTC, state data breach, state data security laws, state data disposal laws, and I've told you, you can forget that. You can skim them if you want. We'll have a short roundup on state laws as it's relevant. For instance, California just passed what we're calling GDPR Light. There's state notification laws, but for the most part, we want to talk about the FTC actions and concentrate on that. So this is the reference up here in the title, and this goes back to the fact that the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, is what we use for unfair and deceptive trade practices. And by the way, if you're in Texas, we do have a great law, the Deceptive Trade Practices Act, DTPA, that I personally love, that has been used in this case as well, but any kind of consumer law, So going back to the FTC, remember it's a federal law, and so they took Section 5 because there was part of the act, part of the law, the word says act, and if you look at the footnote on page 2, footnote 2, it is USC, so we know that's a law, and it declares illegal, unfair, or deceptive acts or practices in or affecting commerce. So the FTC has now interpreted this to mean that we can use this in data breach laws. They are unfair and they are deceptive. Now, we have to say they're definitely unfair when you get your identity stolen. They are deceptive in that we are being misrepresented. So if you look at the policy statement on unfairness, I've put it here. The practice, whether necessary, having been previously considered unlawful, we don't care if it's lawful in the past, we're overlooking that precedent. Oh, ding, 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 offends public policy as it has been established by statutes, the common law, or otherwise, whether in other words, it is within at least the penumbra of some common law, statutory, or other established concept of unfairness. I love the word penumbra. Think of it as a shadow or something that hangs on. In fact, when we get to the privacy issues in the Supreme Court later on, in the 60s and 70s, we saw a lot of penumbras of privacy. We would say the majority court would say we don't have a constitutional right to privacy explicitly, but there's a penumbra of that right in our Bill of Rights. So, in other words, it's within some other penumbra, something very close to that common law, remember court, statutory, or some other established concept of unfairness. Whether it's immoral, unethical, oppressive, unscrupulous, or it causes substantial injury to consumers or competitors or other businessmen. Okay, so this is where they take their power. Now let's think about this, how our law is made. We have statutory laws, United States, federal law, state, local. We have administrative laws, Code of Federal Regulations, other administrative regulations. Quite frankly, memos, we'll see this later, the OMB Office of Management and Budget put out some memos, and they are interpreted as law. They are interpreted as binding. We have presidential executive orders. We have common law. We have a lot of different ways we can make law, just beyond the legislature we typically think of. But that's not the important question here. The important question I want you to ask yourself are, how are these laws interpreted? Go back to this. This policy goes back to 1964 on a case involving cigarettes. Hello, cigarettes. Okay? This is an excellent example of a legal process, of a legal precedent set that binds on different domains. So first of all, let's go back. Who's the FTC? They're a federal agency in the executive branch. They report to Congress, but they are clearly under the domain of the executive branch headed by the President of the United States. They take what is passed by the legislative branch, United States Code, they make their own regulations, and their job is to protect consumers and promote competition. Now, we'll talk later about the SEC, the Securities Exchange Commission, that also has criminal and civil actions under data breach. The difference is SEC is about publicly traded businesses in the United States. Anything that's on NASDAQ, the Dow, the Wall Street, whatever. Whereas the FTC is any and all consumer protection, no matter who the company is. So you will see that the FTC had a consent order with Facebook in 2010 or 2011. They could also have that consent order with, you know, mom and pop's store. That's one's publicly traded, one is not. They take their power, they take their jurisdiction, they take their mission from Section 5 of the FTC Act, which is a law that was passed, you know, over 100 years ago. And it prohibits unfair or deceptive acts or practices in or affecting commerce. And it claims the authority for data security under the unfairness prong of Section 5. Now, I hope you're kind of sitting there and thinking your head hurts a little bit, because this is so interesting to me, that Section 5 of the FTC Act that says unfair or deceptive, and then the FTC says, you know what, data security, that comes under the unfairness prong of Section 5. And I mentioned this, there's Texas, a similar law, DTPA. Quite frankly, every consumer in the state of Texas should know DTPA, because if someone knowingly and willingly violates DTPA, they can owe you 3 times the amount. Recover emotional damages, which one Texas Supreme Court decision, the woman, elderly woman, said she had headaches and stomach aches, and they said, okay, that's emotional duress, pay up, and attorney's fees. So the book also makes an important part. Unlike other nations, the United States does not have a general law that imposes specific privacy and data security requirements on all companies. This goes back to my observation of last week. We don't have a statutory definition of privacy. We kind of all know what privacy is, we just can't tell you what it is. And we can't look to the law, we look at Supreme Court decisions. So let's go back to the cigarette rule, which regulated cigarette advertising. Now, I'm a little older than you all, but I do remember as a kid being able to see cigarette commercials on TV. They are now banned. They've been banned for 30, 40 years. And this is how the FTC banned them. You have to go back to a little bit of history. When cigarettes were first being advertised and sold to the world, you know, there were all these opinions that cigarettes were really good for you. You know, you got to smoke them, and you know, de-stresses you. You went into restaurants, airplanes, movie theaters. People next to you were smoking. There was not this knowledge of secondhand smoke or lung cancer. So in the cigarette advertising on TV is bad. That's what they came out with, said. So the cigarette rule, promulgated by the FTC and later codified by law by Congress, said the injury must be substantial. The injury must not be outweighed by any offsetting consumer or competitive benefits that the sales practices produces, and the injury must be on the consumer and could not reasonably have avoided. Okay, let me give you an example of one that would not fall into this. A cancer patient has chemotherapy. The injury is substantial to that patient. They lose their hair, they get sick. Sometimes the effects of chemo kills them and not the cancer. But that injury is outweighed by benefits to that consumer. It destroys the cancer or attempts to, it prolongs life, it cures them. So this would be a case, something like that, where you say, yeah, there's a substantial injury, but it fails these other prongs. But the cigarette rule, again, is where the FTC came up with this, and it was codified into law, that says if it comes under the FTC Section 5, it must fill these 3 prongs, and. So it's got to be substantial, it's not outweighed, and it's not something this consumer could have reasonably avoided. So think of a data breach. It's a substantial injury, there's no good benefit, and the consumer wasn't protecting that data. That data was being protected by others, so there's no way the consumer could have avoided this. Now, it was codified into law, so it now is a federal law for this legal principle, and I don't want you to get confused with elements for standing. They're very different, obviously, but just don't get confused when I say this has 3 elements and standing has 3 elements. Okay, I'm going to close with this. If you have never seen a cigarette ad from American TV, you are in for a treat. So I've pulled a couple of them up. We'll just play the first part of them. I don't know what happened to, I'm just going to randomly pull this. This was where women's lived. You know, we're so cool. We're getting women's liberation in the 60s and 70s. We have our own cigarettes. Then there was this idea of the marathon man, the Marlboro man. You know, so cool, so manly. You know, you've got your own cigarette, and what is great about this one is everybody can still sing that song for the Marlboro Man, right? So just take a few minutes, and you will especially enjoy the one with Morgan Freeman. Thank you for staying with me. We will now move to video 3.